There is a smell that belongs only to post offices, not the paper, though there was always paper. Not the ink, though the stamp pads left their violet ghost on everything you touched. It was something underneath all of that, something older, the smell of distance, of things that had traveled a long way to arrive in a small place. I noticed it every morning when I unlocked the side door on Elm Street, before the lights came on, before the radiator knocked itself awake, before Mr. Alderman arrived with his coat still buttoned wrong and his thermos already half empty. The smell was there, waiting, like the town itself was holding its breath to see what the morning had brought. You are new here. Welcome. Edmund recalls these things so they are not lost. Small lives, quiet rooms, the people who stood just beside the ones history remembers. If you would like the next memory to find its way to you, there is a small button below. Press it gently. That is all now. Let me tell you about Howard Alderman and the town and the 31 years I spent watching him love his work in a way I have never seen anyone love anything since. My name is Ruth Capswick, though after 19 years, most people in Millhaven simply called me Ruth from the post, as if the building and I had grown together into a single thing. I started as a clerk in the autumn of 1947. I was 23. I had a typing certificate from the community college in Dayton, pair of good shoes, and absolutely no idea what I was walking into. Howard Alderman had been postmaster of Millhaven since 1938. He was 51 when I arrived, a quiet man, medium height, a small gray mustache that he kept very neat. He wore the same 3 ties in rotation, navy, burgundy, and a green one with a faint yellow stripe that I privately felt was a mistake, though I never said so. He shook my hand on my first morning and said, simply, "Every name on every piece of mail in this building belongs to a real person. Don't forget that." I thought it was an odd thing to say to a new clerk. It took me about a week to understand that it was the only thing he ever really needed to say. Mr. Alderman arrived each morning at 7:45. Never 7:44. Never 7:46. I tested this privately for about 3 months. It never varied. He would come through the back, hang his coat on the second hook, never the first, and go directly to the sorting room before he had even removed his hat. He would stand there for a moment in the low morning light, looking at the day's mail, the way a doctor looks at a patient, taking stock, getting the measure of things. The sorting room smelled of mimeograph, ink and dust, and the particular dry warmth of the furnace that ran beneath the floor. In winter, if you stood still long enough, you could feel the heat rising through the soles of your shoes. He would begin to sort by town district. His hands moved very quickly. He had worked in the postal service since he was 19 years old, and his hands simply knew what to do without being asked. I used to watch him from the doorway sometimes. There was something almost peaceful about it, the rhythm of it, the soft slap of envelopes, the occasional creak of the wooden sorting frame, the radiator ticking in the corner. By 8:15, he had the morning's work laid out. By 8, he had read every return address on every piece of mail. This was the thing people did not know about Howard Alderman. He read the return addresses, all of them, every morning, not the contents. He was scrupulously correct about that. 31 years, and never once but the names. the towns, the distances things had traveled. Elkhart, Indiana, Savannah, Georgia, Fort Worth, Texas. He knew, at any given moment, roughly how many Millhaven residents had family in other states. He knew when a new address appeared for the first time. He knew when an address stopped appearing. That second kind, he noticed those most of all. There was a wall in his office. Not a large office, barely room for the desk, 2 chairs, and the filing cabinet that never quite closed properly. But on the wall, behind his chair, he had pinned a map of the United States. A large one, the kind they used in schoolrooms. He had marked Millhaven with a small red circle, dead center, and from that circle he had drawn lines. Pencil lines, very faint, stretching out across the map to other towns. Not all of them, not a line for every piece of mail. Only the ones that carried what he called weight. I asked him once what that meant. What made a letter heavy enough to mark? He was quiet for a moment, poured his coffee, set the thermos down. When someone sits down to write a letter, he said, they're making a decision. They could have telephoned, but they didn't. They sat down. They found paper. They found a pen. That means they needed to say something that required more than a voice. He looked at the map. I'm not reading them. I'd never read them, but I can see by the postage, by the weight, by how many times the address has been crossed out and rewritten. I can see that something is being said. And I think those correspondences deserve to be remembered, even if only on a map, even if only by me. By 1951, there were perhaps 40 lines on that map. By the time I left in 1966, there were over 200. He never told the senders. He never would have. It was simply a private record kept by a quiet man. Of the times, people in his small town had reached out across a very large country to say something they could not say aloud. On his desk, beside the telephone and the stapler and the small framed photograph of his wife Eleanor at Niagara Falls, there was a tin, a biscuit tin, originally, Scottish shortbread, the kind that came at Christmas. The tartan had faded to something closer to rust. The lid no longer closed perfectly and had to be pressed down at one corner to sit flat inside the tin. He kept the undeliverable mail, not all of it. The official undeliverables went through proper channels, returned to sender, or held according to procedure. He was correct about that too, always correct. But there was a smaller category, letters that had arrived for people who had died before the letter reached them. Letters addressed to people who had left Millhaven years ago with no forwarding address. Returned once from a distant city with no longer at this address stamped in red. He kept those, not forever. He kept them for 1 year. Then he would hold a small, private ceremony. Just him, the tin, and the waste paper basket, and he would let them go. I knew about the tin for 6 years before I said anything. When I finally did, he looked slightly embarrassed. The way a person looks when a small, private kindness has been seen. They came a long way, he said. They should have a little time before they're gone. I didn't say anything after that. I just nodded. And the following Christmas, I brought him a new tin, the same brand, the same tartan, without a word about why. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the desk next to the old one. In case this one gets full, he said. It never did, but I was glad the second one was there. The post office closed at 5 o'clock. Most of the staff were gone by 5-15. Mr. Alderman rarely left before 6. He used the last hour for what he called the correspondence, which was, in fact, his own personal letters. He wrote 2 or 3 each week in a small, very upright hand, on plain white paper, with the post office's return address crossed out in ink and his home address written above it. He was particular about not using government stationery for personal purposes. I don't know who he wrote to. I never asked. Some of the envelopes were addressed to names I recognized as former Millhaven residents, people who had moved away years before. Some were addressed to towns in states I'd only seen on his map. I think he was simply doing, in his personal life, what he had spent his professional life facilitating, reaching out across distances, saying things that required more than a voice. On winter evenings, when it was already dark by the time he sealed his envelopes, he would sometimes stand at the front window of the post office and look out at Elm Street. The street lights would be on. The occasional car would pass. Now and then, someone would walk by, head down, collar up against the cold, and he would watch them go with an expression I came to know well. Not sadness, exactly. More like the feeling you get at the end of a good book. Something completed. Something held. One evening in February 1959, I think, though I may be wrong about the year, he was standing at the window and he said, without turning around, "Do you know what I think about, Ruth? I think about all the mail I've sorted in 30 years. All those names, all those return addresses, and I think there is not one of those letters that did not matter to someone. Not one. Even the ones nobody wanted. Even the bills. Even the bad news." He paused. "That's not a small thing, is it? To be the person who carries something that matters, even if you never know what it is." I told him no. It was not a small thing at all. He nodded and picked up his coat and went home to Eleanor. And I stood there for a moment longer in the empty post office, with the stamp pad smell and the particular silence of a room full of things waiting to arrive somewhere. And I thought, I have been very lucky to spend my days in the company of a person who understood what his work was actually for. Not everyone does. Most people don't, I think. They do the task without seeing the thing underneath it. Howard Alderman retired in 1969. At his retirement party, the staff gave him a new thermos. He seemed genuinely delighted by this. He also received a certificate from the Postal Service, which he later told me he'd put in a drawer somewhere and couldn't quite remember which one. He kept the map, though I know because Eleanor told me years later that it was still on the wall of his study when he died. All those faint pencil lines reaching out from a small red circle in the middle of Ohio, toward everywhere that the people of Millhaven had ever needed to send a piece of their hearts. Some of the lines had faded, almost to nothing by then, but they were still there, Edmund recalls. Every story has a quiet witness,